Hello Internet, Daniel with Driving and Dragons, and I'm back. This time we're going to do a little bit of work on some world building. A couple of videos I'm going to punch out here, a little mini series if you will. Today on the Z, got some work on the air system. I'm still trying to work through some of the ignition issues that I'm having, but it does appear that my problem is not air or fuel but fire. I've got a new distributor on order. It's just being an old Japanese car that is not a common restoration project. It's generally more of something that people do engine swaps and stuff like that out of. So the OEM parts are not the world's easiest to find. So getting them shipped over from Japan takes a little bit, and hopefully we'll have a little bit more footage there for that. That said, it's going great. It's doing well, and the car should be on the road so we can get some driving footage. Might even actually have some work done on my Camaro, which is another project car I've got sitting. It's been waiting at the suspension shop for a while to get some suspension work done, but we might actually do some work on that car. I've said this before. I try to be careful how I say it because I don't want it to come across as tchotchke or pie in the sky or crazy, but I know that if I can get this channel up to a couple thousand subs and regular views, I can pick up some sponsorship and a little bit of ad revenue, maybe get a couple $100 a month to where I can dump that into a vehicle. And my full intent and purpose is if I can get to that level with this channel, I'll start purchasing vehicles that I will then just turn around and give away to subs. I'll just do a random drawing, subscriber, you get a car. And we're going to go ahead and restore it and build it. I mean, it'll take a year worth of videos or so to get a car done, depending on what kind of condition it's in when I find it, but that'd be something I think that would be kind of cool. But like I said, it sounds kind of tchotchke and gimmicky, and no, sub to me, you might get a car, but just something I always like to throw out there, something that's sitting in the back of my head. So let's move on to actual tabletop role-playing game stuff that matters, and talk about a little bit of world building. There's been a lot of discussion back and forth about different types of dungeon, your mega dungeons, your mythical dungeons, your layer dungeons, your Gygaxian naturalist dungeons, and all the other kind of stuff that we see throughout the gaming world. A lot of it is Dungeons and Dragons focused, but let's just remember that Dungeons and Dragons focus is something that is always going to be there because it's such a major part of the hobby. But what I want to focus on is some more general world building tips and more general world building kind of do's and don'ts. And this was spawned on, it was came to me because I saw, it's not really a meme, but it was a fantasy world design picture that was posted in a Facebook group, and you had classic fantasy world design, and then underneath it you had ridiculous fantasy world design, and it's predominantly a hit on how some of the postmodern nonsense and the infection of our personal politics and these culture war nonsense getting roped into the actual game harms it. You can clearly see the influence of safety tools and X cards and stuff in the ridiculous fantasy world design when it shows a thing like healing is easy to get and suffering is easily mitigated, and since no one causes harm, all beliefs are equally valuable, and how you feel about things is more important than what you actually do, which of course leads to how the players feel is extremely important and must be protected. That leads to some of those safety tools, which is a bad world design, versus having situations where results have real consequences because you don't have easy access to healing and that sort of thing, particularly in certain areas of the world. And what I'm going to focus on today is actually the upper part, the classic fantasy world design section of that image and how it relates to us in world building. Later I'll go over things like the mythical dungeon, the layer dungeons, mega dungeons, and when things need to make sense, how they make sense, what their justification is, and even to a slight extent some of the arguments that have happened and how I think that a large number of those arguments are not really arguments. What it is people use different perspectives or different definitions. They don't clearly define their terms the way they're supposed to, and then once they start arguing, they don't have the personal wherewithal to step back and say, hey, let's define some terms, or I think you're looking at it this way, I'm looking at it this way, I don't think either one of us is wrong, let's make these adjustments. Or, man, I was misunderstanding what they were saying. From your perspective, that's correct. But from my perspective, I'm correct, and here's why. And the other side turning around and being like, oh yeah, you're right. That doesn't happen, unfortunately. We get ultra defensive, especially, and I'm going to say this. This is one of those things where it's the extremes of the spectrum. And on one extreme, you have the ultra hyper liberal Connie Chang, Mackenzie DeArmond style, ultra leftist culture warrior types over in the 5e space, who you absolutely have to do all this DEI nonsense. You have to sanitize all this stuff. You have to do all these safety cards and shit in order for anything to be right. And you're a bigot, racist, whatever istphobe word you want to use if you don't. And then on the opposite side, you've got a large contingent of the OSR, particularly the Bro-SR, but not all of any group, and a lot of the OSR who are your classical ignorant grognard who is hyper arrogant. And really, they're not arrogant. Let's go ahead and define some terms here, just like I was saying. Arrogance and conceit are two different things. Conceit has no basis in reality. Arrogance does. Arrogance is an excess of pride and confidence that is based on a reality of ability or knowledge. Some of these people in the OSR and Bro-SR are arrogant, others are simply conceited, and they get into the argument, and it turns into, you're an idiot, this needs to be a purity test, this is the IQ test for getting in the door, if you say this, that means you're a fucking moron, and you can't be taken seriously, and this is, if you argue against me in any way, it's bad faith, or they get so defensive that they won't actually move into it. And I think that by clarifying some terms and looking at some of these differences, we might be able to, if we want to be good world builders and we want to design good fantasy settings, we can kind of look at these elements and see how they all work together and fit together, and see these different perspectives and how they work within the game world. So, now that lecture time is over, let's go ahead and move forward on this classical fantasy world design. This is a big overview. Now, this world design is very much a gaming or storytelling world design. This could be used for the broad overview for writing a novel or writing stories. This could also be used as the broad overview as the setting for a game. You can almost think about it as levels. And you can actually see this in game design in a lot of video game RPGs, particularly MMOs and games like Fallout, like your solo RPG, FPS type games. And this is very broad word. This is not talking about developing economies. This is not talking about developing socioeconomic factors. This is not talking about writing histories and developing societies. This is much more broad overview. And what it is you have three major sections. If you put them out on a map, you have civilization, Borderlands, and a wild frontier. And in each step, you have more of one thing, less of another. And this would influence what type of encounters should exist in those given areas. So for instance, in civilization, you have peace and order that's created by everyday heroes. So your police, your fire, your gate guards, your wardens, your harpers, your magical defense corps from the wizard's tower and the wizard school that helps keep magical ne'er-do-wells in line. You have the Baron and his keep, and you have the Duke, and you have the King and their royal forces and their courts of law. So, not necessarily hero in the I'm a 15th level paladin and have all these abilities hero, but hero in the fact that I get up every day, I put on my chainmail, I grab my spear, and I go stand on the wall to make sure that everybody understands that if somebody grabs my coin pouch and tries to run out of the gate, I'm going to step in and stop them. This is where you have, in the map it says superior culture worth preserving. I would actually say this is where you have developed culture. This is where you have cultures that exist and have existed for long periods of time or have become very firmly entrenched because they work and because they service the people. All right, they do actually service the populace in one way or another. That's how they became to be so stable. Whether or not that's good or bad is something to explore in your game. What kind of adventures do you have here? You have traders from within that want to profit by doing, things that are not necessarily above board. You have rigid social class that may not just be based on you. It may be based on things like what your family did in the past, or what your last name is, or what things you have in terms of title and historical inheritance. So you might have to deal with that rigid social structure. You have the legal system that you may have to deal with, where sometimes the law gets in the way of you accomplishing what's good, because you have to work around these systems that are, as I used to say, one size fits all fits none well. In other words, if it fits everybody, it's not going to fit anybody perfectly. Same thing with your courts of law and your legal systems in your civilization area. It's going to fit, and it's going to help the most people in the best way, ideally, or it's going to fit a specific goal, but there's going to be ways that slip through the cracks. This is what makes your lawful evil villain in a D&D context or an alignment context such a difficult pain, is because he knows how to use that legal system to protect himself while he does his evil. So you can't just go into his door and bash his face in with a mace and a hammer. You can't just go cut his throat with a sword or stab him in the back. You have to find a way to either get him to expose himself, get him to trip up within that legal system, or find your own way that it works within that system to get around it. And the trade-off for that is pretty much everybody has a decent quality of life. Taverns are plentiful. You might even have multiple options for food and drink in a lot of these places. You might have more than one inn in a town or a city. You might have open bazaars with trade routes coming in from other parts of the world that have more variety. You may have specialized labor, so you can go to a weaponsmith or an armor smith instead of just going to a blacksmith and hoping they make stuff. You might have specialized stables to get certain kinds of mounts. You may have your, not necessarily the magic item shop, or, depending on your world, you may have the magic item shop, but you may have the shop where you can go get rarer spell components, or you can discuss with more learned mages and lore masters for more magic. That's the benefit, but you also face the restrictions. As you move out of the civilization, you go into the second section, which is the Borderlands. What do you have in the Borderlands? Well, life is a little harder, because out here you can't just go to the market. Out here you may have to, a lot of people are doing their subsistence farming out here. They're not growing, they might have a little extra to sell so they can trade it for a new saddle, or they can trade it for new wagon wheels, or they can trade it for, leathers to make clothing or something of that nature. But for the most part, what they're making on their farms is what they live off of. Now, that's what they eat. You are talking about the places where order and protection is created by exceptional heroes. Not the Baron's troops are marching around and there's units of soldiers that are protecting everybody. But this is where, and these forests, or the towns around this forest don't get overrun because the Great Ranger lives in this forest, and he makes sure it doesn't happen. The Ranger and his friends are here, and there's 5 or 6 of them, and they're 4th, 5th, and 6th level Rangers, so they keep the riffraff out. Or the monastery is over here where the warrior monks live, and there's a great paladin and several clerics there who help provide for the countryside, but they're few and far between, and they have limited areas. The resources become extremely scarce. You don't have a swordsmith and an armor smith and a Boyer Fletcher anymore. You have the local blacksmith, and he predominantly makes what the town or the area uses, and maybe he can make you a sword or patch your armor or something, but he ain't going to have any masterwork quality weapons hanging on the wall, not unless he's some kind of rare thing that's there. Your resources are going to be more scarce. If you want magic items or something of that nature, if you find somebody like, say, the old hermit who lives out in the woods who can make it for you, you're probably going to have to go do something to acquire those actual resources. Because in these Borderlands, survival requires hard labor. And there are things out there, random things that want to kill you. There's roving bandits. There's roaming monsters. There might be an area that's even worse right now because it happens to be a band of orc raiders came in. Or maybe a young dragon came out in the south and is now a problem. The quality of life is lower, but you have more freedom and more opportunity, because when you kill that dragon that came into the south, Nobody cares if you're the son of Viscount so-and-so. They care that you killed the dragon. Now you're a hero. And now it doesn't so much matter how wealthy you are or what your business connections are. People want to take care of you, want to give you more wealth and more opportunity because you saved their entire way of life. Now in the southern part of this Borderlands area, every farm, no, we can't pay you, you've done enough already. You always have a seat at our table. You always have a bed in our house. So you get a little bit more of a balance. There's more danger. You're still going to have some places throughout that are, strongholds, so to speak. There might be a border city or some kind of border keep where the military is there, but between the primary civilization and this outside outlands border keep that keeps eye on such and such horde from the outlands, the area in between is going to be highways that you travel kind of at your own risk. This is also going to be a place where the trade routes are passing through and having to deal with the bandits. And on the main trade routes, you may have more guard posts or outposts. But as you get away from those trade routes, things get more and less civilized. Finally, you have the wild frontier. This is where you have moved beyond civilization, beyond the bounds. The Borderlands is the buffer between civilization and the wild frontier. Out here in the wild frontier, you can kill the bad guy whenever you want to because there is no law and order. If there is law and order, it's in very small pockets. We have this town here and we have our rules here and we enforce them with what we have in them, but it extends to the end of this town and we may make an exception one way or another. Tons of freedom, tons of ability to have reward out here, but the opposition is overwhelming. This is where the orc hordes are. This is where the monsters roam freely. This is where there is no defense on the path. Even if you're on the well-traveled trade route coming from another civilization to the civilization we just left, that road, you're going to be seeing the caravans come armed with their own people. They're going to be the ones hiring not just caravan guards, but well-traveled caravan guards, and you're probably not going to have people in the caravan themselves that are not pretty well able to stand on their own 2 feet as well. Why? Because they're going through an area where there's no law, where there's no order, where you may go past the mountain that has a red dragon in it where an ancient red dragon sleeps and you never know when he's going to wake up. Your civilization is going to be few and far between. You're not finding shops. You're not finding established stuff. If you're doing any trading while you're in the wild frontiers, it's because you are on the road that is traveled by trade merchants and that sort of thing, and you're trading for whatever happens to be in their wagon. There's nothing being produced out here. There's no manufactured goods. And what you constantly have is the wild frontier and the civilization pushing against the borderlands to make them smaller. The civilization wants to push out and shove the borderland into the wild frontier. The wild frontier wants to overrun the borderland to get to the civilization and its wealth. And that's the constant struggle. Security flows out of the civilization, and danger and adventure flows in from the wild frontier. Now on the map, they use the Sword Coast, which I think is a bad example, but in the map you can kind of see an area of it, but it doesn't necessarily always work like it does on this map. In this case, you have the coast, and then you have just a little away from the coast, and then you have out into the wastes, and it works that way. This can also work in terms of a smaller area, in terms of a city. So for instance, you may have, say, the keep on the Borderlands, and the keep is on the Borderlands. In the keep itself, you're basically in civilization. There ain't nothing coming there. And as you move away from it, you're going out into the Borderlands, because you keep on the Borderlands, and you're going into the wild frontier finding things like the Cave of Chaos. You can have a city, and how far civilization extends around that city is going to be based on the overall setting that you've put forward. If you're in a time of great war and civilizational collapse, where you have rebellions and civil war and invaders and the hordes at the gates and that sort of thing, civilization may never extend much more than a city. You may have a quote-unquote nation, or you might have the coast, but, and we'll use the Sword Coast that's on this map as an example. Instead of it being a big swath of blue down the side. The blue is a little ring around Waterdeep, maybe a decent sized ring around Waterdeep, and then it's immediately yellow between Waterdeep and heading north to like Luskin or one of the other more northern cities. And the reason being because at this point in time, that civilization, the whole of the Sword Coast would not be defended anymore. The Borderlands extends into that because of all the turmoil, and your local authorities do not have the resources necessary to defend long stretches of road and areas between cities and that sort of thing. They're hunkered down focusing on those population centers. You might focus on more of a great time of peace where there's a lot of stability. Maybe you're going to move into the term war and you're going to disrupt this, and throwing up the apple cart's what's really going to make things happen. And the start of your game may have civilization, say on this map, extending almost out to the wild frontier itself, and the wild frontier being almost a borderland, because the civilization has gotten so great and so powerful and so strong and so wealthy that it can afford to project its power out into the wildland. Then, of course, for your campaign, you upset that apple cart, and now you have the patches of, quote, borderland and wild frontier all throughout your map. But this is a thing from an adventure design standpoint to think about while you're doing world building on the small scale to put your adventures together and to link different localities. I said earlier in the video that video games do this a lot, and you can kind of think about it in a video game term. If you think about it and you're playing, say, Fallout New Vegas, for instance, you're going to start in Prim, or you're going to start in Good Springs. You're going to move south through Prim. You're going to circle around the southern end of the map, come up through Novak, and then Novak up to New Vegas. And if you look at the progression there, you move from very few monsters, a couple of geckos, a couple of radiated wasteoids and whatnot, and a few powder gangers, to where you start getting worse radiated monsters and more vicious gangs, and now the Legion and the NCR are coming together, and you move into areas where it's hotly contested. Now, granted, you're actually moving deeper into civilization in that post-apocalyptic setting, but you can see it as I'm moving from civilization to Borderlands to Wild Frontier. By the time I make the turn north and I get north of Novak, headed into the New Vegas proper area, all the way over into where the Deathclaws are on the quarry, and all the way up to the north end of the map, and all the way out east to where Caesar's Legion is, that is the Wild Frontier. That's where the toughest monsters are. That's where the most dangerous enemies are. That's where the most powerful opposition is. And that's where everybody's fighting everything. And then as you move back through Prim and the lower part of the map, that's where your Borderlands are. You've got some areas out there that are particularly nasty, but as long as you kind of keep to the road or keep to the main path, you're more or less safe. And then you get up into Good Springs, and aside from the fact that they intentionally border it on the north with "don't go here, this is the worst part ever," if you're in that Good Springs and south, everything's nice and safe from a challenge standpoint. So it kind of buffers in for civilization. And that also shows you how civilization, Borderlands, Wild Frontier, you don't necessarily have to take it literally in civilization as been where the greatest cities and stuff are. It's just that civilization is stability, civilization is wealth, civilization is ability to access things, civilization is order, and is predictability. Borderlands is where you're starting to kind of make things happen. Wild Frontier is where their safety's off. There's no safeguards. Bumpers are up. If you throw it in the gutter, you throw it in the gutter. So, looking at that, tell me what you think below. Like, share, and subscribe. I would love to get to 1,000 by Christmas. And tell me what you think. Again, very, very high level, very, very 10,000 yard view here. As you zoom in, every single thing is going to get, when you zoom in on the Wild Frontier, in this map it's represented by red, it's not going to be all red. It's going to be mainly red with dots of yellow and blue throughout it. Same thing in Civilization. You zoom in, it's not going to be all blue. There's going to be dots of yellow through it, and there may even be a couple of dots of red. But as a big, broad thing, this is a good way to kind of outline your game world before you start sending in adventurers. And even if you play more of an OSR style and you're setting up your hex crawl and your hex map, this is a perfect way to set up your hex map. because it allows your players to have some expectation of what's going on, some expectation of what may happen in terms of encounter, and it gives them a nice warning before they get to the point where everything's just going to annihilate. But anyway, let me know what you think below. See you guys next time.